So it's lovely to be here. Thank you for coming to hear me speak. So what I want to talk about today is really thinking about how psychology and psychological ways of thinking are also political. For me, this is a really, really important piece of knowledge and information. I want to start with this idea of the personal as political before I get onto the psychological as being political. For me, this idea that the personal is political has been really crucial to my own healing and recovery. So the experiences, feelings and possibilities of our personal lives are not just a matter of personal preferences and choices, but are limited, moulded and defined by the broader political and social setting. So they feel personal and their details are personal, but their broad texture and character, and especially the limits within which these evolve, are largely systemic. So of course this concept of the personal as political comes out of the women's liberation movement, and it was a real attempt to start articulating that women's experiences, women's lived experiences of oppression, discrimination, lack of equal opportunity, that these were not just a matter of personal failure, that they were things that were happening within a much wider social and political context. And that was very helpful for me as a young feminist. And then when I went mad and I ended up in psychiatric services, this notion became very, very helpful to me again, that the recognition and understanding that both my experiences of going mad, but also the ways in which my experiences were understood by the system, that was something that was wholly political. Let's go back to the personal. This is a picture of me, aged 5, on the street in East London where I grew up. And by the time this picture was taken, I had already begun to hear voices and have lots of other quite scary and unusual experiences. And the reason that I believe that I began to hear voices at such a young age was because by the time this picture was taken, lots of very frightening and overwhelming things had already happened to me. My parents, my mother and my father and many other members of my immediate family were involved with a group of paedophiles who abused me and abused many other children, both within my family and many other children within the local area. To be subject to that kind of organised sexual exploitation by the very people that are meant to be protecting you is absolutely devastating. I feel quite dissociated from it as I talk to you here about it now, but the shock and the horror and this sort of very shattering experience is something that, even though I've done quite a lot of work to make sense and to heal from those experiences, lives on every day of my life. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what happened to me, although I am endlessly fascinating. What I'd like to talk about really is just to locate my own experiences and really what made me become an activist. So I was subject to lots of very horrible experiences, which left me with this kind of shattered sense of self and this kind of disorganised pattern of internal attachment pattern. Because basically I was one of those children, and actually there are far too many children in our world that are subject to these kinds of experiences and are put in this dreadful position whereby you are both simultaneously dependent on people that you're actually terrified of. It's a hideous dilemma for children to be put in. And, you know, as I said, the abuse that I was subjected to was organised, so there was a deliberate and conscious manipulation of my attachment needs. Which left me with this shattered sense of self, and like many survivors of traumatic experiences, one of the ways that I survived those things was actually by pretending it was happening to somebody else and actually vacating my body. It left me with a whole set of really complex experiences, voices, visions, these kind of trance-like states. As a young woman, I got diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy. I think there's a research paper there actually about different kinds of epilepsy and how they may be trauma manifestations, but I'll just flag that up. just a really, threat responses. These were my threat responses, essentially. This is how I survived these devastating experiences. The first person I ever told about the abuse that I was subjected to, bear in mind, like many people, I was severely threatened if I ever spoke about what had happened to me in very explicit ways. And so I never spoke about what happened to me. I lived on with these experiences and remained silent. And it was actually the birth of my first child where I literally could not contain these things anymore. Just becoming the mother of a very vulnerable little baby just brought very powerful memories back of what had happened to me as a small child. And I ended up in a psychiatric hospital. So the first person that I ever disclosed these hideous childhood experiences to was actually a psychiatrist who was assessing me. And we were in a small room, and I began to, for the very first time, tell him about some of the things that had happened to me as a little girl, feeling quite fearful at the time. And he then interrupted me and said to me that, in fact, he was glad that I was in hospital, that I was in a good, safe place, because, in fact, these experiences hadn't actually happened to me, that I was actually experiencing the symptoms of a serious psychotic illness, that I was actually delusional, and that I was in a good place and I was going to be helped. At that point, one of my voices actually commanded me to pick up a filing cabinet and drop it on his head. Fortunately, I didn't do that because I'd probably still be in a secure unit somewhere now. In fact, another voice intervened at that point, and I have this voice that intervenes at crucial moments where I might do something regrettable, and actually advised me to get myself out of the room. And I quickly got out of the room and went into a cubicle in the female bathrooms and smashed my head against the wall. Because I knew then that actually the very place that our society had provided for me to be safe was actually the place that was going to send me over the edge once and for all. I was very, very fortunate that I was able to escape those services and then access some wonderful psychotherapy. So I guess part of what brings me here today is both my sense of outrage at some of the things that happened to me, and that happened to many people still. Many people. You know, one of the things that people say to me is, well, what happened to you happened 20 years ago, which is right. The problem is I still hear these kinds of responses all the time. Or we hear the kind of response, well, it's awful that you were subject to this horrific abuse, and now you've got schizophrenia. How unlucky. As if these are two separate, things. Or there may be a real acknowledgement that these things have happened to you, but you've got a personality disorder, which, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, is like insult to injury, that people have done their very best to survive devastating experiences, and then we then tell them that their personalities are disordered. Frankly, I think it's offensive. So I'm a bit annoyed about some of that. But I think the other piece for me is that my experience, both of surviving these experiences and having had the privilege to work with many survivors of different kinds of trauma and adversity, is that people can and do recover despite devastating experiences. And this is, for me, one of the difficulties with the biomedical model, that it is so pessimistic about people's potential to heal and to grow and to thrive despite having been subject to awful things. We are more than the terrible things that we have been subject to. And I just think there's not enough belief that people can be okay despite the terrible things that have happened to them. As I said, I was very lucky. I managed to find a therapist that totally believed that I was more than the terrible things that I had been subject to, and that even though I was in quite a bad way, that if we worked together and he could witness some of the things that had happened to me, and we could think together about some of those things, that might be transformatory for me, which, as you can see, I'm healed. It all worked out well. So this was crucial for me in making sense of my own experiences. When I began therapy, I was in a very broken state, and I'd felt very traumatised by my experiences in a psychiatric hospital. And at that point, there was not really much material available in terms of thinking differently about people's experiences. And then I came across this book. I went for a therapy session, and my therapist said to me, here's a book that I'm about halfway through, but I'm finding it mind-blowing, really, really helpful, and I'd really like you to have a copy, and I'll buy myself a new one. He gave me a copy of this, and it was literally life-changing, and really this is for me where this concept of the personal is political really began to emerge out of. So if you haven't read Trauma and Recovery and you think anything I have to say is of any use, then I would highly recommend it. It's a wonderful work. In fact, the New York Times called it one of the most important psychiatric works to be published since Freud. Not sure if that's a compliment or not, actually, but anyway, that's a whole other keynote, isn't it? You know, essentially, as Lucy referred to before, in terms of this three-step approach, Herman advocates a three-step approach in terms of creating safety for people, helping people to feel safer, so that they're then able to start remembering and mourning for the things that they have lost, and then this kind of reconnection with community and society. And one of the things that Herman says is that, you know, the knowledge of horrible events periodically intrudes into public awareness, but it is rarely retained for long. Denial, repression, and dissociation operate on a social as well as an individual level. And for me, that was ever so helpful, because I began to understand my own experiences both as a patient, but also much wider issues in society about dissociation and denial and repression, and that these weren't things that I had just used to survive, but that actually society employs, because to actually engage with some of this stuff is kind of overwhelming, I think, and we have a number of ways of defending against it. So one of the things that Judith Herman talks about is the need to find a survivor mission. She very helpfully articulates that for many survivors who have been subject to the kind of abuses that I have, you are left feeling outraged, and that actually she doesn't pathologise that. She says that that's an entirely appropriate response to these kinds of experiences, but that one of the things that survivors need to do is to find some way of using that rage in a constructive way. So I guess part of me standing here today speaking to you and sharing these experiences is part of my survivor mission. It's about social action and a willingness to speak the unspeakable. So I would also see this as a form of pursuing justice, social justice, because of course for many of us the criminal justice system does not give us justice for quite complex reasons. And again, this idea of you know, the personal and political and the psychological is political. So very much this belief that it's important to speak out about these experiences, I think, for a number of different reasons, which I want to come back to in a moment. So it's not about revenge or seeking compensation for an atrocity, but it is about transcending it by making it a gift to other people. So you're welcome, folks. Another key part of my survivor mission has been my work with the Hearing Voices movement. It's something I'm enormously proud to be involved with. Again, this in itself is a whole keynote, but just thinking about my sort of development as an activist, I began working in mental health, became involved in the Hearing Voices movement, which is this fantastic movement. I'm now the chair of the Hearing Voices Network, have been for many years. And the Hearing Voices Network is one of 33 international networks, an international collaboration between experts by experience, so voice hearers and family members who work in partnership with experts by profession, so academics, clinicians and activists, to question, critique and reframe traditional biomedical understanding understandings of voice hearing. So we very much contest this traditional psychiatric relationship of dominant expert clinician and passive recipient patient, because many of us have found that actually abdicating all of our power and responsibility to an expert figure doesn't work, because what we're told are things that often blame us and fail to acknowledge the things that have happened to us. So what we are advocating, these mutually respectful relationships. And one of the things that Marius Rom talks a lot about, one of the founders of the Hearing Voices movement, a Dutch psychiatrist, is talking about the emancipation of voice hearers. And so it's not about trying to get rid of voices. Voice hearing is part of the human condition. And for many of us, once we're able to engage and work with these experiences, they actually can become quite helpful to us. So we would very much view voice hearing as a significant and meaningful human experience. Part of the way we work is creating spaces for people to share their stories. As we spoke about in the symposium before the break, you know, one of the things I've been saying for many years is we need to stop asking what's wrong with you, and we need to start asking what has happened to you. And of course, a crucial part of that is around people sharing their testimonies, creating spaces where people can share their stories. This is a very nice quote, which for me actually speaks to the ways in which stories operate on a number of different levels. So this sociologist and psychiatrist described the act of testimony as a ritual with dual purposes. So when a survivor testifies, she both purges herself of an internal evil and bears witness to a social or political injustice. So the word testimony has in itself a double connotation of both something objective, judicial, public or political, and of something subjective, spiritual, cathartic or private. Thus, the use of the word testimony implies that the subjective private pain is to be seen in an objective political context. So for me, this is very, very important. You know, the way we are being with people, and actually what are we doing with people? Are we just doing things to people, or are we actually being with people and allowing them to tell their stories and allowing them to affect us? For me, these are very, very profound questions. I was privileged to speak at a conference earlier in the year, Beyond the Therapy Room, which was asking some very important questions about psychology needing to engage with things beyond the therapy room. But I think it's important to remember that actually you can be doing really important political work in the therapy room too, just in the way that you attend to people's experiences and people's stories, and by what you choose to privilege. So I guess one of the things that really strikes me, having been privileged to hear many, many testimonies, is that I and many people don't really have mental health problems. What they have is a problem with oppression, discrimination and stigma. So these are some key things that I've really noticed in the time that I've been an activist. And one is that maltreatment, disempowerment and hierarchical inequalities become enacted within the personal, the professional and the political. That the medicalisation and psychologisation of distress obliterates meaning, and actually not only does it obliterate meaning, it creates profit. I mean, I hate to mention it, but you know, clinical psychologists, you get paid quite well, don't you? Just thought I'd noticed that, actually. So there's big business to be made out of other people's suffering, isn't there? Get a nice fat salary, pension, all the rest of it. Just thought I'd mention that. And it also, I think, for me, raises crucial questions about the role of psychology in perpetuating these hierarchical inequalities and the ethical and political issues that this raises. So I guess it becomes clearer to me that, in fact, the psychological is political. So let's just think about this within the current context in which we're all trying to work. We've already heard mention of neoliberalism. This comes from a paper, in fact my title is informed by a paper written by Joanna Moncrief, a critical psychiatrist. So as we said earlier in the symposium, it's important to note that these are not guild disputes. There are many psychiatrists that would concur with this, many social workers, nurses. There's a critical mental health network, there's a critical psychiatry networks. There are many other professionals that would concur with some of this stuff. So this comes from a paper that Joe wrote, and so if we think about neoliberalism, it has these three manifestations: an ideology that the state's primary role is to protect property rights, free markets and free trade, a mode of governance based on the logic of competitiveness, individuality and entrepreneurship, and a policy package designed to slim down social welfare and integrate countries into a global economy. There seem to be these kind of dual strategies that neoliberalism uses to increase its control, and they seem to be kind of central to the neoliberal project. And one of them is, of course, consumerism, and the other is control. So consumerism and control can actually be viewed as two sides of the same coin. So if we think about consumerism, of course, making us all preoccupied with, have I got the best laptop? Are my children going to the best schools? How big is my bottom? All of this preoccupation with these issues. One of the things that Joanna talks about is the way that shopping has become a leisure activity, for example. And so if we're all preoccupied with how much we're going to earn, how much we can spend, what we need to buy, how we need to keep ahead of the game, that's one way of controlling us and keeping us as active consumers, working hard, buying stuff, paying for stuff. And of course, one of the ways that impacts then for people who can't afford the kinds of things that are being promoted. So you might be a big fan of Jay-Z, but you might not actually be able to live the life that Jay-Z advocates. So one of the consequences of that is the kind of social fragmentation we saw back with the uprisings in London a few years ago, where young people are bombarded with these images of things that they should have and desire and want, and actually they're never probably going to have the economic ability to kind of buy the sort of trainers. That's why it really struck me, all of these kids breaking into JD Sports and all of this stuff. They want things that the people that their heroes are wearing that they actually can't afford. That's one thing. We have the consumerism, and then the other is the consequence of that is this kind of fragmentation that it produces, which then provides this need for things like control. And the two main ways to kind of deal with this kind of fragmentation that neoliberal policies produce are either prisons or psychiatric institutions and medications. So under so-called austerity measures, again, just think about the language that's being used and what that's all about, but there's been a huge increase in things like prison populations, and psychiatric facilities, of course, are in demand to manage the consequences of this kind of fragmentation. And I think the language of mental illness enables this to be done without revealing the social breakdown at its root. So that's led to a significant increase in things like suicide, forcible detention within psychiatric institutions, a huge increase in CTOs, which is interesting because CTOs were supposed to be about actually decreasing the number of admissions in hospital, and actually what we've got is a huge increase in both. And a huge surge in prescriptions. And again, the King's Fund have done some really interesting studies, really, that you can link that there's been a much higher increase of prescription rates in areas where there are greater social deprivation. I think one of the ways that the government and I would say other organisations that are sort of trying to hold on to their power, and I guess one of the things I wanted to think about is what is the BPS and specifically the DCP doing about some of this stuff. But I think one of the ways that this operates is by the use of doublethink, which of course was famously coined by George Orwell in his novel 1984. Does anyone else ever think like we're living like in George Orwell's world? It's not just me, no, there's quite a few head nodding. Good, that's reassuring. Sometimes you think I'm a bit mad, don't you? Do you ever have that thought, or is that just me? And so, of course, doublethink comes from George Orwell. So in George Orwell's dystopian novel, people were meant to hold these kind of contradictory beliefs. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. So doublethink is the act of ordinary people simultaneously accepting two kind of mutually contradictory beliefs, often, of course, in distinct social settings. It's the opposite of cognitive dissonance because, of course, doublethink is notable due to the lack of cognitive dissonance. Thus, the person is completely unaware of any conflict or contradiction. So, I want to sort of think about some of the things that are used every day in mental health to think about how doublethink operates within mental health settings and I guess the way in which psychological processes are in danger of becoming part of doublethink too. So of course, I'm going to quote quite a lot from Mary Boyle. I don't know about you, but Mary Boyle I find so helpful in clarifying so many things that I struggle to articulate, and Mary does it so well for me. So I'm going to quote quite heavily from Mary. It's very nice to have her sitting here and being able to sort of acknowledge her fantastic contribution to helping us. She's been banging on about this stuff for a long time, and I feel really grateful that she and a number of other clinical psychologists have put their head above the parapet and say things that I think a lot of people don't actually want to think about or hear. So, stress vulnerability model, which of course is a way of thinking about people, which is central to many different professionals. And as somebody who has been told that I've got a psychiatric illness, that it wasn't my fault, that I was born with this genetic flaw and all of that stuff, and that the very real and horrific abuse and neglect and deprivation I was subject to as a child was reduced to a mere trigger, I always found the stress vulnerability model deeply offensive, and I could never quite articulate why. And then I came across this quote from Mary, and I was like, that's what is the problem with it. So, the vulnerability stress hypothesis has proved to be an extraordinarily useful and effective mechanism for managing the potential threat to biological models. Its usefulness lies in its seeming reasonableness. Who could deny that biological and psychological and social factors interact? And its inclusiveness. It encompasses both the biological and the social. Surely better than focusing on only one, while at the same time it firmly maintains the primacy of biology by making it look as if the stress of the model consists of ordinary stresses that which most of us could cope with, but which overwhelm only vulnerable people. Thus, we are excused from examining too closely either the events themselves or their meaning to the vulnerable person. Again, drawing from Mary's work. And actually, when we think about people, and you could see it now in the way that the government talks about vulnerable people, I actually just cut some slides because I'm aware of my limited time and how much I want to kind of try and cram in. But this very much now fits into workfare and the way in which the government is using psychological theory, their behavioural unit at the Cabinet Office, and they're using psychological theory, I think, in very Orwellian ways, and this is a really nice example of some of that. So, how the language of vulnerability diverts attention from oppression. So just one example, old people are vulnerable to hypothermia. If we see it as a statement of oppression, the government doesn't pay a high enough state pension to old people to pay their heating bills, and so on. So again, just for me, it's quite Orwellian, this use of language. And then thinking more specifically about in psychiatric settings, this comes from a paper by my good friend John Reed, and thinking about the kind of language that we use in psychiatric settings, things like hallucinations, delusions, and thought disorder. So this comes from a paper that John and co did actually, and what they did is they went back through patient psychiatric notes and looked at the ways in which people's disclosures of real horrific things that they'd been subject to had then been recorded in their psychiatric notes. Some of this is quite upsetting. Another's medical records read sexual abuse, abused from an early age, raped several times by strangers and violent partners. This person believes was being tortured by people getting into the body, for example, the devil and the beast, and had bleeding secondary to inserting a bathroom hose into self, stating wanting to wash self as people are trying to put aliens into my body. Another whose records reported childhood sexual and physical abuse and multiple rapes believes that has never been a child but is an old man who had his penis gouged out and had silicone injected into chest and hips. Another whose chart documents childhood sexual abuse and also documents olfactory hallucinations, in brackets, smells sperm. I mean, I just find that quite disgraceful, actually. You know, in brackets, smells sperm. I think this is doublethink in action. And again, I just want you, I mean, I'm raising some uncomfortable questions and I'm aware of that, but I think that's kind of my job, actually. I think this kind of language, like hallucinations, delusions, thought disorder, you know, what it's actually enabling is this kind of a clinical assessment which creates a kind of illusion, or actually is it a delusion, of neutral objectivity. But as Sami Tamimi, who we've mentioned earlier, another psychiatrist whose work I really admire, he describes diagnosis as a subjective opinion masquerading as a fact. And I was speaking to Sami recently, and I said to Sami, I'd actually go one further, Sami. It's subjective opinion about someone else's subjective experience, but yet it then masquerades as a fact. So I think talking about people in this way invalidates, it mystifies, and it renders unintelligible normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. It facilitates this sort of decontextualisation, this distancing, this diminishment and denial of devastating experiences. And the crunch of it is that it results in collusion and complicity, focusing on the deficits of individuals rather than on the injustices of perpetrators. And for me, this is kind of the heart of the problem, really. And if we talk about perpetrators of injustice, I mean, within my own experience, it's pretty clear what we mean by perpetrators, but I mean perpetrators of injustice in the broadest sense of the word. Again, quoting from Mary, child abuse and neglect, school and workplace bullying, domestic and sexual violence, discrimination, poverty and unemployment, events which involve relatively powerful groups, governments, corporations, men, white people, adults, damaging less powerful groups. So in the case of emotional distress, then context seems to include or even equate to the operation of power. So if we think about this operation of power, what does it mean within traditional psychiatric services? This, again, from Mary's paper, Making the World Go Away and How Psychology and Psychiatry Benefits. This comes from the second book that I helped to co-edit, Demedicalising Misery. So let's have a think. How does psychology and psychiatry benefit by decontextualising people's experiences? Well, if we start with psychiatry, it's no wonder that psychiatry is fearful of context and has had to devise so many strategies to avoid it, because context constantly threatens to make emotional and behavioural problems intelligible, or, to put it another way, it threatens to abolish psychiatry's self-defined subject matter. And then psychology. What investment does psychology have? Well, the first concerns psychology's extreme insecurity about its academic and social acceptance as a science. So by minimising or denying the importance of life experience and context, by choosing not to expose the operation of power, mainstream psychology gains the double advantage of both appearing more scientific and also avoiding the risk of offending the powerful by seeming to implicate them in causing distress to others. So here, the powerful actually means any group that might make a public fuss over suggestions that they harm others and be taken seriously. Dun, dun, dun. Clinical psychology. In following psychology and minimising context, clinical psychology gains the added advantage of placating psychiatry. So in fact, what we seem to have are three very insecure groups who have implicitly agreed not to expose the operation of power in return for academic and professional privileges. Clearly, this isn't true of all psychiatrists, psychologists, or clinical psychologists, but these are clearly problems for all professions to kind of engage with, and they're uncomfortable questions. So what is the antidote to doublethink? Well, again, I could spend hours talking about this. Don't worry, I won't, though. But what is the antidote to doublethink? Well, every presentation of distress in theory, research, teaching, case discussions, media presentations, and everyday conversations between service users and professionals would have at its centre, unless there is strong evidence to the contrary, the idea that people's feelings and actions are consonant with their past and present experiences. There is meaning in all so-called symptoms. Really, that's the bottom line. So, in light of all this, what can be done? Well, many things, I think. And one of the things that I often talk about as an activist is that, you can make a difference literally with a person sitting in front of you. You can make a difference in terms of advocating change within your service. You can advocate change in terms of what you choose to publish and what kind of research you choose to do, how you choose to do your research. And in terms of speaking out, I think there's a number of different ways, trying to agitate in terms of activism. Much of the work around human rights begins with accurately and aggressively reframing the status quo as an outrage. I think these are human rights issues that we're talking about. So I think language is crucial. If you change the language, you've begun to change the reality, or at least to begin to open the status quo up to question. And of course, what protects an outrage are disguises, circumlocutions and euphemisms. This comes from Rebecca Solnit's work, who I really value her work. She's a human rights activist. So, for example, enhanced interrogation techniques for torture, collateral damage for killing civilians, the war on terror, for the war against you, me, and our civil rights and human rights. So what might that mean in psychiatric settings or psychological settings? I think it means deconstructing the biomedical model and this traditional psychiatric relationship of this sort of dominant expert clinician and the passive recipient patient. I think we need to stop using scientifically meaningless words and stigmatising words which focus on deficit and chronicity, like schizophrenia, personality disorder, etc., etc. So I think we need to start decolonising this medicalised language of human experience and reframe and reclaim ordinary human language to describe people's experiences. I think we need to share power. We need to advocate and practice mutually respectful collaborations. We need to take a stand. I mean, this is the bottom line. You all, as clinical psychologists, are actually in quite a privileged position, particularly working in a hierarchical system. You're quite high up that pecking chain, aren't you? So you need to actually use that power to bring about change. So what might taking a stand mean? Well, I guess you have to ask yourself a question, am I willing to take a stand? Because actually, in my experience, taking a stand is a bit scary. It requires courage. It requires not needing other people's permission to say things. It means not caring if other people like you or what you have to say. It means creating some discomfort in the room. I think another question for me is, what is your investment in the status quo? It's an important question, isn't it? Because the bottom line is privilege is when you think something isn't a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. So if it's not a problem to you personally, the problem doesn't exist. And one of the things that really concerns me as a white person is why there are way more black people in our services than white people. What is that about, And what are we going to do about it? And that is something that isn't just the responsibility of black people. It's the responsibility of all of us. Are you willing to speak truth to power? Because the bottom line is that if you just quietly get on and do your job, you are remaining a bystander and you are complicit. This was from a very nice paper looking at the way that psychology is being used in workfare and other sort of by the benefits agencies, and one of the things they say is that there are good reasons to prefer the politics of rights and justice to the discourses of positive psychology. Here's some examples of psychologists, clinical psychologists that are taking a stand, and efforts that I really applaud. The walk the talk that I mentioned earlier, where a group of psychologists are really saying that, you know, it's not just about talking the talk, it's about actually walking the talk. So I would check them out. I know they did a presentation yesterday. I also am thrilled by the work of the Psychologists Against Austerity. They believe that they have a public and professional duty to be speaking out against the further implementation of austerity. And also that psychological theory is not being used in this kind of Orwellian way, but it's actually being used in a much more helpful way to sort of make the links between these kinds of economic decisions and the impact that it has on people psychologically and, of course, in other ways, because, of course, equality is the best therapy. And, of course, the project that I and others have been involved with for the past 3 years, this is totally about taking a stand and making very visible these links between things like power, threat and meaning. So I think the beyond diagnosis work that we've all been engaged with is a crucial part of this speaking out. Framing symptoms as reactions or responses to threats, as survival strategies, creative and necessary at the time, is hugely honouring of people, rather than using this really reductive and language of deficit. And it helps to restore the link between traumatic adversarial events and circumstances, as well as between distress and social injustice. So I think this has the potential to promote safety, integrity and moral imagination within psychiatric and social systems. And as I said earlier, I mean, it's badly needed, folks, isn't it? It really is. It's quite nice to think about something like a moral imagination and making something that much more explicit and a driving force within services. Because the bottom line is, folks, there is no more neutrality in the world. You as clinical psychologists and us as citizens are either part of the solution or you're going to be part of the problem. Thank you for listening, everyone.